Today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Age-Appropriate Formulation Development for Pediatric Trials, Challenges and Considerations. My name is Margot and I'll be your X-Talks moderator for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes and includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Catalent, who helped develop the content for this presentation. Catalent is the leading global provider of advanced delivery technologies, development, and manufacturing solutions for drugs, biologics, gene therapies, and consumer health products. With over 85 years serving the industry, Catalent has proven expertise in bringing customer products to market faster, enhancing product performance, and ensuring reliable global clinical and commercial product supply. Catalent employs nearly 13,000 people, including approximately 2,400 scientists and technicians at more than 35 facilities. And in 2019, the company generated over $2.5 billion in annual revenue. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's event. Dr. Rachel Myers completed her undergraduate degree at the University of Mary Washington and her Doctor of Pharmacy degree at the University of Connecticut. After graduation, she completed a PGY1 residency at the University of Wisconsin Hospital and Clinics in Madison, Wisconsin, and a PGY2 residency in pediatric pharmacotherapy at the University of North Carolina Children's Hospital. In her current position, Dr. Myers provided both didactic and experiential education in pediatric pharmacotherapy for pharmacy students and residents. She practices in the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit and the General Pediatric Unit at St. Barnabas Medical Center, and her research interests include pediatric critical care, infectious disease, and dosage forms for children. Our second speaker is Dr. Matt Ling. Dr. Matt Ling has over 20 years experience in the pharmaceutical industry with experience in analytical, formulation development, and advanced drug delivery spanning all phases of development. He is interested in the use of drug delivery technologies to address the challenges of modern pharmaceutical agents, including bioavailability enhancement of poorly soluble drugs and developing products for pediatric administration. He is currently the Director of Scientific Services and a member of Site Leadership Team at Catalent Nottingham. So without further ado, I'd like to hand the presentation over to our first speaker, Dr. Rachel Myers. You may begin whenever you're ready.
Hi, again, this is Rachel Myers. I'm going to be talking to you today about clinical needs for pediatric oral dosage forms. And again, I'm a practicing pharmacist at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, where I work in the pediatric ICU and general pediatrics floor. So today we're going to talk about some of the difficulties that we have in today's landscape in terms of administering oral medications to children. I'm sure many of you have experiences in this as parents as well. We're going to talk about some of the dosage forms that are prone to problems in children, and also we're going to talk a short while about excipients and recognizing the need for more information on excipient content in medications. So I think everyone's familiar with the current advances legislatively about pediatric drug development, and that these have resulted in quite a lot of new medications for children and new labeling for children and new dosage forms as well for children. As of, I believe it was August of last year, 2019, there were 814 new medications with new pediatric studies. Now, we can study these medications and find out the pharmacokinetics of them in children and whether they work clinically or not. But if the child don't take it, of course, we know it's not going to work. And that's a famous quote, of course, drugs don't work in patients who don't take them. So the dosage form and how we get it into children is very important to consider. So we'll talk now about some less than perfect dosage forms. Usually clindamycin is my example. It's an antibiotic, fairly commonly used, often used for infections such as cellulitis. And it's just it's a nightmare to kids, to be perfectly frank. The taste is very bitter. The smell is very poor as well. I've heard people describe it as dirty gym socks, which is never good, especially if parents are using spoons, which we would never recommend. But if a child catches a whiff of that, it's never going to enter their mouth. And the other problem is the concentration is very dilute. So I worked out a couple of examples here. So a 12-month-old would receive close to 7 milliliters 3 times a day. And 7 milliliters might not sound like a lot for us as adults, but for a 1-month-old, that's quite a lot. And it's a big challenge for parents. And this is probably the #1 medication that we have parents complain about and just frankly are unable to get their children to take it. Even a 5-year-old would need to take close to a tablespoon 3 times a day. And so again, it's 3 times a day, frequent dosing. It's a fairly long course, generally going to be 10 days for most indications. So that this is quite difficult. Now, while this medication is my classic example, even my classic example of a good medication, which is ceftonir, can also be a problem. Just last week, I was chatting with a good friend of mine, and her son, who's not quite 2 years old, is on ceftonir, which is generally a pretty good tasting medication and usually just once a day. And she couldn't get him to take it. She was hiding it in his bottle. He got wise to that and wouldn't take his bottle, so she lost medicine in the bottle. He spits it. She's just having a heck of a time getting him to take it. So even those medications which we think, taste good, can also sometimes be difficult for patients or for parents to give. This is kind of my troublemaker list here. Augmentin or amoxicillin clavulanate is very chalky tasting. So while amoxicillin is generally well tolerated and accepted by children, adding that clavulanate just adds this chalkiness to it. And this is one I've had trouble with my own children getting them to take it. Keflex is, again, a bitterness, a bad taste. Cefuroxime is a problem. Tamiflu, which we're using a lot of right now, is a problem. And in fact, just yesterday on my unit, I had a child, an 8-year-old, who refused it and was throwing it up, which we think was quite on purpose. And we ended up having to use the IV equivalent of Tamiflu on her, which costs over $1,000 a dose just to get it in her because she refused to take the Tamiflu. So these are real problems with real clinical implications for these patients. Azithromycin, Bactrim, and voriconazole also can be problems as well. So a lot of medications also that we use in kids, we don't have a commercially available liquid, and so oftentimes we end up sending these patients to compounding pharmacies, which is great that we have that option, but sometimes for parents, getting a medicine compounded can be quite expensive and not always covered by insurance, and so it can be a barrier for parents or for children taking these medications. Some of them, especially in more recent years, have been developed into compounding kits, which are easier for a non-compounding pharmacy to make. In 2017, spironolactone was actually FDA approved into a liquid form for adults, not for children. But because it's FDA approved and it's a liquid, we have been using it in our NICU population. And of course, it's actually not a one-to-one conversion between the old traditional spironolactone that we were using and this new liquid. But because it makes it so much easier and so much safer when it's a commercially available product, almost instantly NICUs across the country started using it. And it's been working fairly well. Tacrolimus, we'll talk about the problems that we have with that. It's now available as oral granules for suspension. And tanezumab is another one that we get compounded quite a lot. And as I said, lots of problems with getting medicines compounded. Obviously, they're prone to human error. And a lot of times, these medicines were not necessarily meant to be put into liquid. And if you don't shake it enough, it can result in doses being different from dose to dose. So one issue that's kind of arisen in the last couple of years is NIOSH. So NIOSH is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health here in the United States. And in 2016, they came out with their updated list of anti-neoplastic and hazardous drugs. And this list was quite expanded from previous lists. The thing that we have to keep in mind, and what I wonder about as a pharmacist who counsels parents about these medications, is this list is really intended to protect healthcare workers and does not comment about parents and caregivers at home and the risks that, that they see when they're preparing medications. So it's something we need to think about when we're giving these medications at home. So this is an example from the list. This tells you what you need to do when you have a medication that's on the list. So for example, for an oral liquid here, if you are administering an oral liquid that's on their list, you need to be wearing double chemotherapy gloves and a protective gown. And if you expect vomit or potential spit up, you should be wearing eye and face protection. So that's the recommendation for these NIOSH medications. So I'll show you here, tacrolimus is one of the medications that's on the list. Again, this list is quite extensive. Tacrolimus has shown to increase the risk of lymphomas and other malignancies, and also has reproductive effects, and so that's why it's on the list. So again, remember from the previous slide, if you're giving this medication, you need to be wearing double chemo gloves and a gown. So this is from the package insert, and this shows what a parent should do with the medication at home. So you can notice that in the picture, there's no gloves, presumably no gown, and we are mixing it with water, basically unprotected. And in the package insert, it says you only need to wear gloves during preparation of the IV solution, when you're cleaning up spills in the hospital, and when you're preparing the oral suspension in the hospital. So, but nothing about what parents are going to do. And keep in mind, a nurse in the hospital may be exposed to this for a few days at a time, but a parent is exposed every day. And for something like tacrolimus, it's generally for the life of the child. So this is something we need to think about, is protection of our caregivers. And this is why we won't use this product in the hospital, because we can't put our nurses at risk. So we still compound the solution from the capsules, because we can do it in the pharmacy and dispense in oral syringes from the pharmacy. So going along with our tacrolimus example, the way we have to give medications in the hospital now, and what's being used by most hospitals, is what we call barcode medication administration. So these are capsules. This is actually a picture I took. That's my hand. And they have to be barcoded in order to go up to the floor and be given, so that the nurse can scan it before she administers it to the patient. So this is an example of a well barcoded medication, but not all medications come this way. So you have to consider, if you're preparing a medication that's going to be used in the hospital, that how it's going to be used. So if we get it in a bulk bottle, we have to pre-pack it. So this here, these are pictures from my hospital. The machine on the left is our pre-packed machine for tablets and capsules. And you can see kind of the little yellow strip at the bottom that's coming out there. And that's where they come out. So they go in the top and they come out the bottom, and we can, you know, print the name of the medication and everything on those little foil packets that they come out as. And then the machine on the right is for fluids. So a lot of times, generally, we'll do like 5 ml doses for liquids that come in bottles and not in unit dose cups. Just to give you an idea of how much we have to do for this, my hospital is about 600 beds, and we have one technician who about 90% of his job, so almost full-time technician, is spent just doing this all day. So that's the volume of medications that we're getting in and being forced to pre-pack, because they don't come the way that we need them to. So the other issue is, going back to NIOSH, when we get medications from the NIOSH list, we don't want to put them in this machine, because obviously this machine is going to touch a lot of medications even in one day, and to clean it is quite cumbersome. So as an example, we used to carry all of our anti-epileptic medications as brand name only, because that's what most of our patients were on, but they only come in bulk bottles. And so we've had to switch to using generics, because at least they come pre-packed. So think about where your medications will be used, and keep in mind hospital use when you're thinking about how medications should be packaged. So devices are a big interest of mine. So I think everybody knows that really the oral syringe is the best device that we should use to measure. It's the most accurate. Also provides that ability to give a little bit at a time. And I found with my kids, if I just give it to them and they can control how quickly they get the medication, that seems to work well for them. But these are examples of different kinds of ways that parents will measure, teaspoons, of course, being the worst, but those little dosage cups are out there as well. So this is a study I always like to quote. Basically, a couple of pharmacists just surveyed some people coming into their pharmacy, and they asked them to measure a 5 milliliter dose with either an oral syringe or a dosing cup. And so the little gray bar that kind of goes across the screen there, that's from 4.5 to 5.5, and that's what they considered basically close enough, an acceptable dose. And you can see that with the oral syringe, which is the little triangles, more people hit that acceptable dose with the oral syringe than with the dosage cup, where more than half of people, most people who were using the dosing cup did not measure the appropriate dose. So even dosing cups are just, people aren't necessarily measuring correctly. This is what I consider a landmark study that came out in JAMA about 10 years ago, and they looked at how over-the-counter medications are packaged. And so this is just an example from that study. So 2 tablespoons and 1 tablespoon are the doses, but the cup that was provided in the package didn't even measure tablespoons, it had teaspoons in it. And then this is another example where you can see that there's a dose of 2 teaspoons and there's no teaspoon mark or no 2 teaspoon mark on the cup. It only has 1 teaspoon, and if you can see there, or this is a half teaspoon and 1 teaspoon, and then there's 2 tablespoons. There's also a lot of markings on there that do not apply to this particular medication, including the old-fashioned drams, which I know I learned what that was in pharmacy school, but that was the last time I've ever used that in my practice. So in terms of over-the-counter versus prescription products, a student of mine and I did a little study about 5 years ago, and we looked at prescription products and found that only 12.8% of those products actually had a measuring device that was packaged with the product. So a lot of times we are relying on pharmacies and pharmacists to dispense syringes or appropriate measuring devices with their products. And it's quite variable by which pharmacy you go to. I've had pharmacists dispense the measuring spoons to me. I had a dose of an antibiotic that was 3 mLs, and I got home and looked in the bag, and there was nothing in there for me to measure it with. So fortunately, being me, I had plenty of oral syringes at home, but otherwise, a person who's not a pharmacist might not have those measuring devices at home. So this is a really big gap in terms of how we give these medications to kids. Also, a big issue for us in hospitals is the stability of these medications in syringes. So when we get an order, the pharmacist verifies it, and a label prints for a 24-hour supply of doses. The medication's prepared, and then doses are drawn up in oral syringes and sent to the floor, and the nurse then would administer it. The issue is sometimes, obviously, patients go home, or the dose changes, or the drug changes, and we have leftover. And if we have leftover, oftentimes we will save those because why not? We'll just save it until the expiration date from the bottle. In fact, in our emergency department, we have, I think, 4 or 5 antibiotics that we prepare common doses. For example, amoxicillin 400 milligrams in 5 ml. So we prepare those pre-made and keep them in the refrigerator down there so that they're ready to go and the nurses can just grab them when they need them. And in terms of storing them in those syringes, amoxicillin is an out date of 2 weeks. So we give them a 2-week out date. But how long are those medications actually good? Are those medications good in those syringes? We don't know. There's really nothing known about that. So we just, at this point, kind of ignore the issue, for lack of a better term, because we just have no information on it in terms of how good these syringes are for storage. In 2015, the FDA had a warning from Becton Dickinson, BD. Basically, BD said, you're not supposed to be using our syringes to store these medications that you're compounding or you're repacking. It's not meant for storage. It's meant for immediate use. All the different strengths. They were particularly concerned with the stopper, which they have since replaced. But there's also just the syringe barrel itself. So a lot of concerns there, and it's both IV and oral syringes. This is a big issue for us in the hospital that we really have no data on and no solution for. And this issue was also reported by by ISMP, the Institute for Safe Medication Practices. So I did want to speak briefly about excipients. Alcohol is a big problem for us. The AAP recommends that no more than 5% ethanol be used. Phenobarbital is 15% alcohol, methadone is 8% alcohol. And the population that we use these drugs in a lot is our neonatal population. So here we have a patient group who really is the worst patient group to be using ethanol in. And we have 15% alcohol and 8% alcohol in these liquids. Some pharmacies actually, because of this issue, some hospitals will compound them rather than use the commercially available products because of the issue. Dexamethasone I bring up because we actually give the IV form orally in our patients who with asthma or croup that come into our emergency room or get admitted, because the volume needed is also very dilute medication. So the volume needed for most of our patients approaches 50 to 100 mL, depending on the age and weight of the patient. And so with a 5% alcohol on top of that huge volume, it's just really not doable for us. So we give the much more concentrated IV form, and usually our doses are under 1 milliliter with that. Another issue that's come up in the last few years is carbohydrates. We have a lot of patients on ketogenic diets, and this issue came up for me again just yesterday. We had a patient on a ketogenic diet who had pneumonia, and he needed amoxicillin clavulanate, and there's carbohydrates in there, but with our generic version, there's no information on how many carbohydrates are in there, and we really need that information so that we can include those carbohydrates in our calculations for the ketogenic diet. And so it's very, very difficult to get this information on carbohydrate content. Sometimes I'll look at the PI and I'll see there are carbs in here, but it will not tell me how much. And calls to the medical information departments at these companies very, very rarely results in any help or information. And so this can be a really tough thing. In fact, compounding pharmacies this is big business for them, and they end up compounding a lot of medications for these patients in order to control the amount of carbohydrate. So we're getting better. Orally disintegrating tablets are great. We use lansoprazole as much as we can. Prednisolone also comes. It's a little cost prohibitive at this point. My favorite is the ondansetron orally disintegrating tablet. It's a great option for kids who don't have an IV, who are actively vomiting, and we really can't give them the oral liquids. That's been great for us. Mini tablets, the only one that I'm aware of that's available in the United States right now is some of our cystic fibrosis drugs. This is Orkambi. We just have to keep in mind with mini tablets, the population to be treated, and if they do have a gastric tube, that it may possibly clog the gastric tube, and so that has to always be kept in mind. And so just a final little tidbit from my practice. How do you think nurses actually crush tablets to give in a G-tube? So this is a picture of sodium chloride tablet, and we have pill crushers on the unit, but that takes a lot of force and a lot of time, and it gets messy. And so what the nurses actually do, and more than one nurse has told me about this practice, is they take those tablets, they open up the oral syringe and put it in the barrel of the oral syringe with some water, and then they let it sit. And then they kind of mix it up by moving the stopper around, and then they administer the medication. And they'll let it sit there for a half an hour and wait till it gets a little mushier, and just kind of they swish it around in there, and so that's how they give it. So it's always helpful to talk to nurses when you want to know about how medications are actually administered, because they have a lot of tricks up their sleeves, and they're very clever, and they have a lot of ways of doing things. And so you just need to keep that in mind. So finally, just keep in mind, studies that get these medications approved in children are often done under ideal circumstances, and we have to consider that real world situation and whether the patient will actually take the medication. An ideal dosage form for kids should taste good, but again, not too good. Be easy to prepare, easy to measure, easy to administer, and again, safety of caregivers, especially considering those NIOSH medications, is really important to consider. And we want to limit the amount of excipients that are harmful, such as alcohol. Consider G-tubes and those needs depending on the medication you're using. And in general, we just need more information on that excipient content. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Matt Ling. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. That was a great insight into how drugs are used in the real world. Always good to hear how the formulations are being handled in a real clinical setting or a home setting. What I'm going to talk about now is some of the thinking and the drivers that go into the development of the pediatric formulations. So how do we determine which sort of presentation we would be taking forward for a particular drug, and what are the formulation options that we think are viable ways forward. So first of all, just like to have a think about some of the reasons why there is a growth in pediatric development programs and studies at the moment. On both sides of the Atlantic, there's been legislation put in place to really try to improve the number of drug products and medicines that are developed for pediatric usage, to try to move away from children being treated with off-label treatments, to ensure that the real data is being generated to support dosing of medicines in a pediatric population. So on the European side, so the European Medicines Agency, we have the concept of the Pediatric Investigation Plan. So this is typically submitted to the agency from late phase 1 onwards. And the PIP is a development plan that's aimed at making sure that the clinical data is generated through studies in children that will then support the authorization of the medicine for use in children. There is a requirement that all products that are going forward for marketing authorization for the adult indication also need to include the results of the studies from the PIP, whether those are positive or negative study results. The medicines that result from PIP studies, there are a number of incentives to run these studies. So eligible studies will may benefit from a 6-month exclusivity extension. For orphan drugs, there may be 2 years market exclusivity, and for medicines that are developed exclusively for pediatric dosing under a pediatric use marketing authorization, there could be 10 years of market protection there as an incentive. So there, as well as the moral and ethical reasons for developing the medicines in a pediatric setting, there is also an incentive for companies to embark on these programs. An important part of the PIP is that the PIP is reviewed by the Formulation Working Group of the Pediatric Committee, so the PIDCO FWG, and PIDCO will be considering the formulation that is being proposed. They'll be considering the age appropriateness of the formulation, how it's administered, the palatability, the excipients and composition, and the suitability of those in the setting being used. And there's a real drive to not include excipients in there that aren't required to be in there. So this is an area that does get a lot of attention. On the other side of the Atlantic, so in the US, there is a few layers of legislation. So we have the Pediatric Research Equity Act, PREA. So that has mandatory studies for studying the drug in a pediatric setting. Again, we have the requirement for age-appropriate formulations, and historically, there have been a number of exemptions, so indications where there's a justification put in place for not running the study in children. That is becoming less common. So in indications such as cancer, it was commonly waivers were commonly assigned on the basis of the cancer type not being particularly prevalent in children. However, the 2017 RACE Act, so the Research to Advance Cures and Equity for Children Act, under those terms, if the drug is active against a particular target that is also relevant in a childhood indication, then it may be required to run the study in that indication. There's also the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, BCPA. The difference there is that these are voluntary studies, and they can be rewarded with 6 months exclusivity. And then effectively a mirror of the PIP, the Pediatric Study Plan. This would be put in place sort of towards the end of phase 2, and certainly prior to phase 3. So thinking about some challenges that we would face when we're developing medicines. So first of all, if we think about the DMPK challenges, so it's easy to think of children as being small adults, but when it comes to how the body handles medicines, they really aren't. The gastrointestinal tract of a newborn is very different to that of an adult. The pH of the GI tract, or different parts of the GI tract, can be different. Acid production in the stomach is quite low in newborns, and so you have a less acidic environment in the stomach. The metabolic enzymes that are present in children will develop over childhood, and so metabolic routes can be different. I think we've already heard some of the issues around swallowability of formulations and similarly palatability of the formulation. So how easy it is to for the child to swallow the formulation, and palatability. So how we will ensure that the child does actually take the medicine and it doesn't get spat out again. There are a limited choice of excipients that can be used to address some of these issues, and we need to ensure that the excipients that we're using in the formulation are really the absolute minimum required in order to get the effects. And then some of the other issues, so going beyond the formulation, the ethics of conducting clinical trials in children, I think that has historically limited the development of pediatric medicines. And we've also heard from Rachel around some of the challenges around dosing accuracy, and particularly when we're dealing with the very small children, so the newborns and babies, where potentially the volumes that need to be administered are small. So some of the formulation strategies that we could consider. So the first thing to think about is what is the age of the patient population that we're going to be treating with this this product. So is it going to be a newborn baby? Is it going to be a child who's being weaned, that's on solids? Is it an adolescent? And taking some of those considerations, we can think about what sort of dosage forms may be appropriate for that patient population. So at the older end of that spectrum, small tablets or even the adult tablets may be may be okay, depending on the size of them. Alternatively, oral dispersible tablets, so tablets which rapidly disintegrate within the mouth, can be a convenient way to administer the drug. An effervescent, so really a tablet that is dispersed in water and then administered, is another possible dosage form. Multi-particulate products are becoming increasingly of interest, and we'll talk a bit more about those later in the presentation. But we could consider granules, spheroids, so coated particles, coated pellets, or mini tabs as multi-particulates. Liquids and suspensions. So we've already heard about the issues with alcohol content. We don't want to have sugars in there, or at least carcinogenic sugars, which it may present risks to the children's teeth. And increasingly, we want to be avoiding the presence of preservatives. Taking preservatives out of the formulation also then means that the multi-use bottle is going to be less prevalent. So there's a trend towards unit dose dosage forms. For any of the formulations where the drug is going to be exposed within the mouth, taste masking or taste barrier approaches may be required. So if it tastes bad, you may be able to get the child to take it once, but they won't take it a second time. So there we can consider the use of sweeteners or flavors. We can look at techniques for coating the drug, so putting a barrier around the coat. There's molecular barriers such as cyclodextrins or ion exchange resins, where the drug is bound up in a resin, so you administer the granule there, or the application of a barrier coating that prevents release of the drug in the mouth. So some thoughts around the ideal properties of an oral medicine. So we want it to be easy to swallow. We want acceptable organoleptic properties, no toxic excipients. We want a wide range of dose adaptability for accurate dosing, particularly when we're needing to dose adjust by the age or the size of the child. Solid dosage forms versus liquids. So solids, they work well with unit doses, but would need to be manufactured in a way or presented in a way where you can dose adjust, and would need to be manipulated to be suitable for neonates and very young children. In recent years, to look at some of these challenges, the UK government sponsored a consortium of companies and academic organisations to run a programme researching some of these challenges. Juniper Pharmaceuticals is now part of the Catalent family here in Nottingham in the UK, and we were involved in this programme alongside some of the big pharma companies in the country and some of the leading universities within the UK. Some of the output of this consortium is available through the website at the bottom of the slide there. There were a number of work streams within this consortium. So there were methods. There was a development of methods to evaluate taste and acceptability in clinical studies. So ways to assess how acceptable a formulation was in a patient population. There were work streams looking at the modelling of exposure in children of different ages. So both looking at the in vitro testing of drugs and the in silico modeling of the PK in different age groups. And then where we had a lot of involvement was around the evaluation of different technologies for administering drugs, and particularly in the area of taste masking. Looking at the types of formulations that are available or are options, there's a very good review that was published recently in J-Pharm's side, which looks at the formulations that have been registered over the 10 years leading up to this publication. And you can see that there are still a lot of ready-to-use formulations there, a good number of oral solutions and suspensions. There's a reasonable number of tablets. But standing out there on the right-hand column, the multi-particulates are a growing area. So that was deemed to comprise sprinkle capsules, so capsules that would be opened and the powder or the granules inside there sprinkled to administer to the patient, or the use of oral powders, oral granules, or mini tablets. So thinking about some of the top considerations for product design. So the top priority is really to think about the patient, so the age range, the taste, palatability, and swallowability issues that the drug or the formulation may present for the patient, and any excipient effects that could impact on the patient. So, for instance, some of the issues that Rachel's highlighted around carbohydrates, but also issues around the osmotic pressure that an excipient may exert within the gut that can lead to bloating or diarrhea and unwanted effects. We need to think about the treatment, so what the disease is, the treatment setting, the dose and dose range, and how that needs to be adjusted, and how frequently we're going to be dosing the product. We need to think about the caregiver, so what's the experience of the person who's going to be administering the drug going to be? Is that going to be a healthcare professional who may have access to a pharmacy, or may have experience in manipulating formulations on a daily basis, or is it going to be a parent or guardian who may be less familiar with this type of process? And then, of course, as scientists, we need to be thinking about the molecule, so the drug that we're formulating. So what are its properties? What are the basic physical-chemical properties, its solubility, its pK, its log P?
Maybe like a couple seconds at the end, but
where does this fit in the biopharmaceutical classification system?
Moderator,
the BCS system that's often used is really designed around adult dosing. The pediatric setting is quite different. Yeah. The volumes of the intestine and the stomach are very different in children. So a drug that might be a BCS class 1, highly soluble, highly permeable in an adult may be poorly soluble in a pediatric setting. So thinking about taste. So the consideration of taste is often the first consideration that then determines which direction we need to go with for the formulation subsequently. And as part of the SPEED program, there was a review performed of the available taste assessment techniques, available and emerging techniques, and there was quite a diverse range that were considered. So some of these, such as the brief access taste aversion test. So here we have a rat model where the taste of the formulation is assessed by how often a rat would accept a drinking bottle, and by counting the number of licks, you could correlate that with the concentration of the drug in the in the drinking water, and there is actually a good correlation between the acceptability of the rat and equivalent studies in a human taste panel. The electronic tongue was part of this study, and I'll talk about that a bit more shortly. And then there were also more novel methods, so cell-based models, or there was a model looking at zebrafish and amoebas. The review at the bottom covers some of the literature in this area. So looking at the e-tongue, so within our facilities in Kansas City, we have an alpha moss aster-tree e-tongue. So the e-tongue consists of 7 electrodes, and the potential difference is measured between the sensor and a reference electrode. The electrodes are inserted into the solution of the drug, and there are a number of applications we can put this to. So a good starting point for the formulation evaluation is a bitterness prediction. Bitterness tends to be the taste type that will lead most to aversion. So we can compare the bitterness of an API compared to bitterness standards. Taste masking, we can see how a drug formulation is masking the taste effects of a drug, and we can look at the effect of that formulation on masking the taste. And we can also get a rough comparison of the taste of a solution or a formulation against the 5 basic taste types by comparing them with standards. So an example of a bitterness prediction assessment here. So the top right plot is a plot of a number of compounds of different bitternesses that have been assessed in a human taste panel and scored on a 0 to 20 scale. A value of 10 is deemed to be the threshold for acceptable bitterness. So by calibrating the e-tongue against these standards, we can then compare test solutions of the API, ensuring that we're working within the linear range of the e-tongue, and we can determine where the acceptable bitterness limit would be. So at what concentration would we deem the solution to be acceptable? And you can see on this plot that we've probably got a concentration of around probably 5 micrograms per mil, so where the line is crossing the 10 score line. So we would be aiming to get a formulation. So if we're working with a barrier formulation, we'd be ensuring that in a simulated saliva dissolution test that we wouldn't be exceeding that concentration over the duration of the residence of the formulation in the mouth. Another way of using the e-tongue is to look at how well a formulation obscures the taste of an API. And here we measure the solutions of either the placebo formulation or the formulation with the active in there in the presence of the excipients, and using some statistics to take the response from the 7 electrodes and translate that into a sort of a taste space. We can see how close the taste of the placebo formulation is to the taste of the active and excipients formulation. And you can see there that the blue pair of formulations, so formulation A at the bottom of the plot on the left, you can see that the placebo and the active API are quite a distance from each other in this taste space, whereas the red formulation is a lot closer. And in this experiment, the concentration of the masking agent has been varied over the plot, and you can see at the highest concentration of masking agent, we're getting the most effective taste masking. And then you can determine the percentage efficiency of that taste masking by comparison with the unmasked samples. So to take the output from that taste study, we would then feed that into this sort of flow chart that Jenny Walsh has published in Advanced Drug Delivery Reviews. So think about the need for dose flexibility, think about the acceptability of the taste, the solubility of the drug, any bioperformance considerations, and working down through the decision tree, you can work your way through to some formulation types that would be a good solution for those systems. And also need to consider the ages of the children that we're working in. So whether we're in a neonate situation or with older children. Size and texture of the formulation can have a significant bearing on the swallowability of the drug. So some ways to address this. So oral dispersible tablets can be a good approach. So a tablet which very rapidly disintegrates in the mouth. And there are a couple of technologies, Zydis ODT and Zydis Ultra, which I'll talk about a bit later. There are also the ability to manufacture oral dispersible tablets or mini tablets using excipients that have very quick water uptake and disintegration behaviors. And there's some commercially available excipient mixtures, so Gallan IQ, Ludiflash, ProSolve ODT, for instance, that can give a good route to an oral dispersible tablet. There's also the multi-particulate approach. So a multi-particulate may be required to allow barrier coating to address taste, but in order to ensure that we're addressing the texture and swallowability of the formulation, control of particle size is very important for these. So some examples of some multi-particulate products. We have examples across the top. So on the top left, we have some inert pellets that are coated with drug and then coated with a barrier coat, such as an ethyl cellulose or a methacrylate polymer. We could have hot melt extruded pellets. So here we've intimately mixed the crystalline API with extrudable polymers, and the polymer, as it's extruded, has been very tightly pelletized. So we've got a good tight particle size distribution. And the third example is a waxy granule. So where we have a granule where the API is embedded in a waxy or lipidic type matrix, which inhibits the dissolution of the drug in the mouth. The mini-tab options. So a mini tablet is typically a tablet of between 1 and 5 millimeters in diameter. More often, we're looking at probably 2 to 3 millimeters. And these can offer a good way to allow dose adjustment by counting out the number of mini tablets, either at the point of administration or filling into the mini tablets into sprinkle capsules or into sachets. So mini tablets, so they combine the advantages for manufacturing of regular tablets. The throughput of the manufacture can be increased by having multi-tip tooling on the tablet press. So each compression will yield a high number of tablets rather than just one. We can get good control over the size and uniformity of the mini tablets, so good repeatable dosing with the mini tablets. They also have a good surface that can be coated, so we can apply barrier coats to inhibit taste on ingestion, or barrier coats that inhibit release when the mini tablet is maybe mixed with soft food prior to administration. You can also coat these using standard coating techniques, so either in a pan coater or a fluid bed coater. And because it's a tablet formulation, it can offer a quick way to go from the adult formulation, so the adult tablet formulation, across to a pediatric formulation without needing to reformulate significantly. And if we have a formulation where there's maybe the need for a bioavailability enabling technology, such as a spray-dried dispersion, this could be a way to present that in a pediatric form. You can also use the same sort of format to manufacture oral dispersible mini tablets, so using excipients that will facilitate that. Each mini tablet, though, is very small. So a typical mini tablet would weigh maybe 7 to 10 milligrams, and so even if you've got a good high drug loading in there, it's maybe only going to be maybe 3 to 5 milligram of active per mini tablet. So the likelihood is that multiple mini tablets will need to be administered. So a question that has been looked into in a few studies that presented on screen is how acceptable are mini tablets in a population of children of different ages. And here the mini tablets have been administered to children of different ages, and their responses have been studied. And we can see in one study here, so children between 6 and 12 months were found to be capable of swallowing mini tablets, and by comparison with administering a sweet liquid formulation of syrup, it was actually found that the mini tablets were preferred, surprisingly. And in a further study following up on that, the number of mini tablets was looked into. So 25 or more mini tablets were well tolerated, and there was even evidence suggesting that up to 400 mini tablets was still preferred to the equivalent dose of a syrup. So there is the potential to translate a mini tablet formulation into a reasonable dose of active. I wouldn't be advocating that you go as far as 400 mini tablets, but there is scope there to consider the number that you could administer without too much constraint. So moving on to some of the oral dispersible technologies. So at Catalent we have two proprietary technologies, Zydis ODT, which is a freeze-dried tablet. So this tablet, when you put it in the mouth, it dissolves extremely quickly, so literally seconds, and it's gone. Zydis Ultra is the next generation version of this. So Zydis ODT is typically capable of administering or delivering about 100 milligrams of API in a single tablet. The Zydis Ultra technology allows that to be increased to about 350 milligrams, so significantly increasing the drug load. What Zydis Ultra also brings is some taste masking capability, which we'll describe it on the next slide. So the technology that's applied here is an API particle coating technology. So the host particle in the diagram is typically going to be the active compound, and then that's mixed with excipient particles that are a lot smaller, and using resonant acoustic mixing, the different particles are intimately mixed so that the larger particles, the API particles, are coated with the smaller particles. So, so the smaller particles would typically be a wax or a polymer of grass excipients. Initially, you get the particles just coating the API particles, but as the system warms up through particle collision, the coating particles start to fuse, and you generate a film that coats the API. And in doing so, you create an effective barrier when the drug is administered into the mouth. And also a coated particle at very high drug load. The Zydis ODT manufacturing process involves the formulation of the API being solubilized, or for the Zydis Ultra, they have a suspension which is then filled into blisters into the wells on a foil blister, which is then freeze dried and sealed up. So unlike a normal tableting process where powders are compressed, here the product is actually manufactured in the blister, and this leads to a very porous drug product, which can take up water in the mouth very quickly to give this very rapid release in the mouth. So I think a good formulation type for a pediatric setting. Some of the presentations that we've talked about, so the multi-particulates and the mini tablets, these could be filled into stick packs. So you can provide the unit dose through different fill amounts in the stick pack. So the stick pack, it's I guess a lot of you will be familiar with the type of presentation we're thinking about. If you go to the coffee shop and the sachet that your sugar might be in, that sort of stick pack, but with materials that are of a much more sophisticated nature. A number of different stick pack formats are available. So depending on the dose that we're needing to pack, so you can get a wide range of filling weights. So from 0.1 grams up to 10 grams or even beyond could be filled into these stick packs. And then you could administer this either by opening the sachet and administering directly into the mouth, or by dispersing in water and administering in that form. And these sachets, through the design of the scoring and the tear line on the stick pack, they can be made child resistant, so the child wouldn't be able to open them. Finally, another output from the SPEED program, the review article at the bottom of the slide, thinks about how we select the formulation based on the age of the patient population. So considering whether we are dosing a neonate population, infants, children of 2 to 5, or 6 to 12. And from looking at through the literature, you can see on the flow chart here some of the recommendations and limitations around the different types of formulation that could be developed. And we see that the multi-particulates have good a good range of acceptability, maybe not in neonates. Similarly, oral dispersible tablets, and the mini tablet has good broad applicability. And of course, the liquid formulations are dependent on the concentrations and the volume that the drug can be incorporated into, offer broad usage as well. So finally, just to summarize, there are a wide range of pediatric product types available that allow the delivery of drugs in age-appropriate formats. So the choice and some of the thinking that we need to put into designing the product. So we need to think about the patient or caregiver acceptance, the age and age range, the unit dose and the dose range, and the dose graduation. The API properties, taste and palatability have a big impact on steering the formulation design. We need to think about the suitability of the excipients and regulatory acceptance of the formulation approach. So I'll close the presentation there, and would like to hand back to the moderator. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. Now I'd like to invite our audience to continue sending in their questions or comments right now using the question window for the Q&A portion of this webinar. I've already received a few, so I'll start with those. Our first question is, which are the companies working on pediatric medicines that are making them easy to administer?
Hi. So I think hopefully you'll see from the presentation that we just given that consideration of how the formulation is handled, administered, and where manipulation is required by the caregiver. These are factors that are very actively considered in the design of the formulation. So it's certainly an integral part in the formulation design process at Catalent. There are also device companies out there who are able to or are developing systems that will aid the accuracy of dosing. So, for instance, there are systems that can be used to count out the dose of a mini tablet from a bottle, so an alternative presentation to the stick pack, and yeah, that can aid administration of the mini tablet.
Thank you for that answer, Dr. Ling. Our next question is, does EMA require pediatric study results or approved PIP only for authorization?
I think there I would refer you to the EMEA regulations. So their website has some quite detailed guidelines in there that I would refer you to. I'm not a regulatory expert. It's I think that there are the default position, I think, is that the study needs to have been performed. But there are waivers and deferrals that are possible for different indications.
Thank you for that answer. Our next audience member asks, could you comment on adequate/appropriate excipients for pediatric solid dosage forms and where to get reliable information from?
Okay, so there's a very good database for excipients in children, excipients for pediatric use, through the EU PFI website, so the EU PFI, the European Pediatric Formulation Initiative. So they have their STEP database, the Safety and Toxicity of Excipients for Pediatrics database, which aggregates the information available on the safety of different excipients. The database isn't entirely exhaustive. It is growing all the time as the body of literature also grows. The other place to look is the CHMP, so where there are position papers and opinion papers on the use of excipients in children. In a similar way, there's also information in the use of these compounds in foods that also is a useful resource.
Thank you. Our next question is, when you develop ODT formulations like Zydis, do you have designed specific blisters or other dosage forms for pediatric patients?
So for Zydis, the blister, as you'll have seen from the schematic of the manufacturing process, is an integral part of the product. So the shape of the blister determines the shape of the tablet, and so yes, a specific blister would be developed to fit the requirements of the formulation. So you have the opportunity to consider the size and the shape of the tablet to make it more amenable for administration.
Thank you. Our next audience member asks, for the bitterness tests by electronic tongue, how do you generate the correlation curve? Does it still need taste indicator to correlate with the concentration measurement?
So the e-tongue, it is calibrated against compounds of known bitterness. So when I say known, so these are compounds that have been assessed for their bitterness through human taste panels. And as part of the setup of the equipment and running of the experiment, a calibration curve would be run at the same time, and then using statistical tools, the signals that you get from the different electrodes are processed to generate a value for each of those reference compounds, and then plotting those out as seen on the slide, you can correlate between the signal from the electrodes and the score that the human panel had given the bitterness indicators.
Interesting. Thank you for that answer. Our next audience member asks, do you have any information on whether stick packs or sprinkle capsules are preferred from compliance/regulatory standpoints?
I can't speak to the regulatory standpoint, but from a compliance standpoint, really in the United States, at least at this point, our main experience is going to be with the sprinkle capsules, and the ones that I've used in clinical practice seem to be fairly well tolerated, and we have good experience with them.
Thank you, Dr. Myers, for that answer. Our next question is, can you specify which generic company is focused on developing pediatric oral solutions?
Yeah, there's a couple that are out there. I know Cutis Pharma is one of them that's developing some of these kits for oral solutions, and then Silvergate Pharmaceuticals is another one that I'm familiar with that's developed a few of these medications that we had traditionally compounded and now makes them commercially.
Thank you for that answer. Our next attendee asks, what sort of drug load can be achieved in a multi-particulate?
So depending on the type of multi-particulate, there will be differences in achievable drug load. So the Zydis Ultra particles, so the coated API particles, are obviously going to provide a very high drug load there. The coated pellet type multiparticulates, so there you have an inert core particle, which is often a cellulose-based core that the API is coated onto, and then a barrier coat, a taste masking barrier coat is applied to that. And just based on geometry, essentially, so balancing drug load versus size of particle, the drug load is more limited, and so you're maybe looking at around sort of 25 to maybe 40% drug load on a coated particle.
Thank you, Dr. Myers. That brings us to our next question. How are mini tabs administered, particularly when a high number are to be given?
So I think the papers that I quoted in the presentation, they discuss some ways of administering the tablets and the mini tablets. So ways that were found to be acceptable within those studies. And there, the mini tablets can either be administered directly, so in the way that you would with an adult formulation, so putting the mini tablet in the child's mouth and administering with water. That's probably practical with a small number of mini tablets, so sort of single digit. Alternatively, dispersing the mini tablets in a soft food, so maybe a yogurt or an applesauce or that type of soft food, would be practical for children that have been weaned. If that's the route of administration, then we would obviously need to ensure that the formulation is compatible with soft foods. And if there are any coatings on the mini tablets, that those can withstand the exposure to the soft food.
Well, thank you both very much for those answers. We've reached the end of the question answer portion of this webinar, but if you have further questions, please feel free to direct them to the contact information showing on your screen. Thank you everyone for participating in today's conference. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, please join me in thanking our speakers, Dr. Rachel Myers and Dr. Matt Lang. Also, feel free to share the recorded archive with your friends and colleagues using the link now attached in your chat box. We hope you found this conference informative and have a great day, everyone.